Hello and welcome to CSS Hybrid Video number 5 entitled Backgrounds, and we'll be looking at lots of different ways that you can use background images and background color to enhance your web pages. And we're going to take a look at our starting point and then our ending point. This is actually our ending point. Here's our starting point. You can see it's a page that's pretty much done except for there's no backgrounds of any kind, not much color, no images compared to our final result, which is here. Let me point out where the background images are. First of all, there's a background behind the H1 itself. This is this big image that spans across the top. There's also a little background image supporting the bottom of the trees in this other element below it. There's a purple gradient down this portion of the right-hand side. That gradient is used again across these H4s, which we see there in those menu areas. And there's also a green gradient across down this column. And there's also background images that get swapped in when we hover over. And then finally on the body, there's a watermark image here down toward the bottom in the center that stays fixed behind the text. So there's quite a number of background images that we'll be including into this starting point, excuse me, again, which looks rather plain to begin with. But there is a lot of code already in place, both XHTML code and CSS code, which does the positioning of things, floating, and takes care of all the font and text properties. So we're just going to focus on building the styles for the background. Okay, and first we're going to take a look at what we have file-wise. You should have a folder called CSS Video 5 Backgrounds, and in that folder these files should be there. First of all, the HTML document called GreekIslands.html. Then there's two CSS files, one called basic.css. This has all the rules that were in place that we just saw that take care of the layout and font and text properties primarily. And then there's a second CSS document called backgrounds.css. It currently contains nothing but a comment, but that's where we'll be doing all of our work. And so the Greek Islands HTML document links to both of those files. And then we have our graphics. For example, here are the buttons. This is the image when it's up, this is the image when it's down, and then the text just sits on top of it. So we really only need two for as many buttons as we might end up having. We have down here, this is the image that went across that H1, across the top of the screen, and this is the little picture of the bottom portion of those trees, the tree trunks as it were. These are of course not to scale. This is the original image for the logo of this mountaintop travel company, and what I did to make the background that acts as a watermark is I just kind of took the text out and faded the rest of the image until we got something that was almost invisible so that it didn't interrupt with the text, and we'll see more about that later. And then there's the purple gradients. Here's the one that goes across the right hand side, the green gradient across the left hand side. So that's what we have to work with. This is the Greek island image that's not a background, it just is in a normal IMG tag. Okay, so we're going to need to work with, of course, the code. So I'm going to select all three of those, and I'm going to open them with the HTML validator Lite. You may have another way you need to get into your editor, but that'll work for me. And then we can take a look at the HTML and the CSS so far to know what we're working with. I'm working, by the way, with version 6.52 of the CSS HTML Validator Lite. And here's the HTML, or XHTML as it were. We can see the two links to the CSS files. We have backgrounds.css here and basic.css. The backgrounds has just primarily this comment across the top and then some empty selectors. I didn't bother to fill in the properties because that's what we'll be doing. but I did fill in the selectors to save us some time. So you can see we really don't have all that many rules really that we need to write, but we'll have to work through those so we make sure we understand them. Back to the XHTML document. Let's just go through a little bit of the structure of this document so we can make sense out of our selectors. The body is going to be one of the selectors we work with in order to get that fixed watermark background that stays in place as you scroll the page. And another one that I needed to place in there was a div just in front of the body, which doesn't actually close until we get right before the bottom. So it basically is just a wrapper around the entire page, sole purpose being that we can then attach a background to it and kind of get the effect of having two backgrounds on the body. That's a typical trick. Though I would use the body for the one that needs to be fixed as you scroll, i.e. cannot handle fixed backgrounds on things other than the body. The H1 really ends up being given a height that is equal to the background image that we put across the top part of the page. So we'll be putting a background on the H1. Then the section just below the big H1 area is the place where the breadcrumbs are. It's just a list of links across left to right for, indicating where you've been, starting at the home, moving to the packages link for travel packages, and then choosing European travel packages, the Mediterranean, and then finally the page that we're on, which is Greek islands. So there's just kind of a set of links that you typically have towards the top of the page where you can back yourself up to any of the previous pages easily. Okay, and so that's in its own div with an ID of breadcrumbs, and we'll be putting that tree trunk background image just below where the trees are in the H1 background. We'll see that later. Next comes a div which contains a bunch of links on the right-hand column. It's the island information. We're looking at, just to remind us here what we're doing, here's the H1, here's the breadcrumbs across there, here's the island guide, so we're talking about putting some backgrounds in that area. Here's the fixed background again that we have on the body itself. Okay, continuing. As we move down now, we hit a div for the navigation area. This is where the actual buttons are on the left-hand side, the green columned area on the left, and a little traveler's tip below that. And so that section is on the left-hand side here. Here are the buttons and the little traveler's tip below. So that area is indicated there in the highlighted area, and we're going to put, of course, the green graduated background as well as the background on the links themselves to get the buttons. Continuing down, we have the main section of the document itself, which has the foreground image of the Greek island, as well as a lot of the text supporting the travel packages, and a copyright section down at the bottom, which gets its own special styling. Okay, so that's essentially the set of the structure that sets up the selectors that we'll be placing these backgrounds on. Okay, if you look at basic.css, there's quite a lot of styles here, and we're not going to go through it all, thankfully, but you might want to look through it, at least sections of it, to understand more about how the initial page was set up. And I was careful to document it pretty well in terms of breaking it up into sections. Here's some general page styles. Remember, this has everything except the backgrounds. Here's a bunch of heading styles indicated here, so H1 through, I think there's even H1 through H6, even though there's only H1, 2, 3, and 4 in the document. But just in case we ever do add H5s and H6s, I go ahead and list those out, at least in terms of their font sizes. Here's the breadcrumb styles. Here's the main column styles with a number of items there. Some general link styles, and then styles for the navigation buttons. And notice The navigation area, the div with the nav ID, is floated to the left and given a width of 150. Again, this is the left-hand column, so that's floated to the left. I'm trying to get the layout for you here. The island info styles, also given an explicit pixel-based width, is floated to the right. So the two columns, the one on the left has been floated to the left, the one on the right's been floated to the right, and the rest of things, the main column in the middle, just pretty much then just sits there in the middle, and we can see that it's been given some heavy margins to stay out of the areas of the other two columns. Here's the main column styles. And if you look at these margins now on the main column in the middle, it's been given a 0 margin on the top, but 140 pixels on the right, so it stays out of the way of the floated column even below it, and no pixels on the bottom, and 150 on the left. Okay, we look again back here, and this will make some sense. See, what we want to do is make sure that this text down here, excuse me for that shifting, we don't want the text to come below the box here, so we put a margin on this text to keep it away from the edge, otherwise it would wrap around. Same thing over here, it would wrap around. So we put big margins on the left, on the right to keep it out of those areas, and we float these things into place there. So the layout is in place completely into what we would call a 3-column layout. Alright, now let's get to the backgrounds. The fun begins. We're going to go to initially the body. Okay. We have some styles already on the body. Nothing that we really need to worry too much about, but keep in mind things are kind of split between these two, and I wouldn't normally split the two CSS files quite in the manner that I have. There's no reason to isolate background images in a separate file, but for our purposes obviously we're focusing on that, so that's why I did so. Okay, let's begin with our first background. These are all going to take the property name background. We're using the shortcut property of the background rather than have to say background color, background image, background position, background repeat, etc. We're just going to use the background shortcut, and then we can list the property values much like you would something like a font shortcut, except for there's much less complications here. So first we'll start with just the background color, and we're going to use this format for background color using RGB. These are numbers between 0 and 255. It's 228, 238, 229. That's just how it worked out to match up with the background elsewhere on the page. And so that's basically a very light gray with a little tinge of green. You can see the green number here is a little bit larger than the two red and blue numbers. Okay, and we're going to stop the property setting there and see what our result looks like after saving. We'll go to a browser window. When I refresh, you can see the green coming in over the white. So this is kind of a background that's going to end up really being only in a few places because of all the other backgrounds that will go on top of it. Alright, so that's a starting point for us. Now we want to put the image in, and we can just list that next. Background images come in with a property value that starts URL and then lists the actual file name. And I'm going to start off by actually bringing in the wrong file on purpose. It's called, you don't even need to do this, because I'm just going to fix it in a minute. So you can just watch. Logo.mt.top.travel.gif. Close the parentheses off. So the file name goes between the parentheses, the word URL out in front of it, no quotes on it. And this is the image before it gets washed out. And it's going to be repeated because I didn't say no repeat. And it's not fixed yet, so there's a lot that needs to be done to improve things. But when we refresh, we see a number of problems. First of all, this image needs to be washed out. You can see the text is unreadable, obviously, because this is, I've seen people actually use backgrounds like this, so I'm doing this for a point. Don't make your background so much of a foreground that you can't read the text. use something that's very much going to stay in the background and not interfere with your ability to read the text. Okay, so let's go fix up this mess by adding some other properties. So we wash out the image in a graphics program. In my case, I used Photoshop. And the result is BG underscore MT underscore, you should be doing this too now, top underscore, sorry about the file names here, watermark dot GIF. So it's BG for background, mountaintop for mountaintop travel, the name of the company, the made-up company anyway, and watermark because that's the type of image it is. Okay, that's going to be a little bit better. And let's look in the browser and see. When we refresh, you can see that now things are much less intrusive. However, it's repeated all over the place, and it also scrolls along with the text of the page, which I don't want. So first thing I'm going to do is tell it to stop repeating. The background repeat property has a value called no-repeat. So I put that in there, and that'll have a big help in keeping the repetition of it out so that we only get one copy when we refresh. Okay, there's the copy. Now by default, background images are located in the top left and then are repeated from there. We told it not to repeat, so it just sits there. Alright, now we need to position it where we want it, and I've chosen to put it, now when you give positions, you do the horizontal first and then the vertical. And we're about to run out of room here, so I'm going to bring these down. I'm going to do the background color and the file name on the top and bring the other properties down below. So we're going to now tell it its position, which is going to be in the center of the page and at the bottom of the page. I'm just going to kind of keep it out of the way in the center. It still is not going to be fixed. So we save, we go to the browser, and we're just looking for the repositioning of it. Where did it go? There it is, down towards the bottom of the page. You can see it there. Now it's interesting, it's actually off screen entirely when you first look at it, in IE at least. If we go to Firefox and refresh, which we haven't done for a little while, same effect, down there at the very bottom. Okay. Now these two browsers don't always handle things the same, but so far they are. Now the last thing we need to do is say that it's fixed. When we say it's fixed, the positioning is going to change a little bit. Plus the main thing with fixed is that the image will not scroll when the page scrolls. Okay. And the positioning, as a side note, the positioning that you give when it's fixed, the positioning is with respect to the browser window itself, not to the object in which it happens to exist in the HTML. So let's go back now to IE, and I'll refresh that. And now look where our background is. It's down at the bottom of the visible portion of the page, and it's fixed. It does not move. So as you scroll the page, it stays there. And the same is going to be true in our other browser, Firefox. Now when we refresh, you don't have to have Firefox going to do this, but actually it's a great browser, and I'm using version 1.0 of it now. Alright, let's go down now, and we've pretty much finished off the body, so let's move down to the H1. Now the H1's an interesting situation because I've got a pretty big, remember that's the area where we get a pretty big background. Here's our final result here. There's the background. This is all the background on the H1 itself. Remember, an H1 extends to the edges of the margin. Now the margin had been set to 0 for this page, so it starts to the very left and runs to the very right. But an H1 isn't usually this tall, so I had to give the H1 a height that matched exactly the image itself. And let's take a quick look at that. This is the image we're talking about. It's called BG Mountaintop Scenery, and you can see here the dimensions are 720 wide by 80 tall. Now 720 isn't enough to cover the full width of even an 800 wide browser, much less a 1024, so I've carefully constructed this image so that it can repeat right to left seamlessly. but we don't want it to repeat vertically. So we make our H1 exactly 80 pixels high. All right, we come back and look at the basic CSS for the H1 here, and you'll see by no coincidence the height of our H1 has been set to 80 pixels. Okay, the margin is 0 on it, by the way, and the body likewise has margin of 0. So that H1 is going to be right on the edges, left and right. Alright, so let's write the styles for that, going to backgrounds.css and write the H1 background. Okay, so the background for the H1 will begin with a color. Now the color is there just sort of as a fail-safe in case the image for whatever reason didn't show up. Okay, because the image pretty much takes up the whole space, so the background really doesn't show up. And notice I'm using a more familiar color number format than I did before, and we'll have a mix of different color units in this project. Okay, then a URL to give us the background image. It's bg, as we saw before, underscore mt underscore top underscore scenery. It's the mountain scenery dot JPEG. It's a JPEG file. So no transparency, which is why our background color isn't going to come into play really at all for us. And we're going to repeat it in the X direction only. Of course, there's no room for it to repeat vertically anyway, but just in case something happened vertically, we don't want it to repeat. It looks stupid when the mountain shows up one above the other. And where do we want to position it? Well, we'll position it, I'm positioning on the left and I'm positioning on the bottom. The reason I'm doing that is just in case, for whatever reason, that H1 somehow grew a few pixels in some browser for some reason. I don't want the image to repeat, and I want the image to be at the bottom of that area. So what would happen would be that this background color would take up a couple of pixels across the very top and really not even be noticeable. So it would still work pretty well, just in case. Although that positioning, in our case, I don't think would matter. If we left it out entirely, it would default to left and top and be okay. All right, with those changes, we come back to our page here and refresh. This is in Firefox. And you can see now the image coming across. Now I want to point out to you that it's only 720, so it's stopping right about here, and it's being repeated, and it's picking up this part and repeating with the blank area there. This can really be seen if you have a wider screen. So if you go out, and I happen to have a picture of this same screen when it's at 1024 by 768, and what you can see is that right about here we start repeating, and we get out about this far and we start to see the beginnings of that mountain here. So it's a nice effect. If you go even to a wider resolution, you just pick up more of this mountain, but you'd have to be at resolutions that really don't exist much at all to actually get it to come out this far. So basically you get the start of another mountain, which works pretty well instead of having a big blank area over here. So that's why that was done with the repeating and the seamless work with the graphic. Alright, so we're done with the H1. We're going to move down now to handle this breadcrumbs area. We want to make it purple, and we want to put the bottoms on the trees, which is a nice little effect. So let's work with the breadcrumbs area now. If we have the selector in place, again we use the background as the property, and the color is going to be pound 440044. Now whenever I really, in real life, I haven't done this in earlier videos, but I do now that we're talking about color and backgrounds, there's a shorthand way of writing these kinds of colors, and whenever you have the same number repeated in each of the three components of the RGB color number, you can shorten it. So 44 can be 4, 00 can be 0, and 44 can be 4, and the number ends up being just 404. And I do this all the time because oftentimes that's the case with the numbers you're given. It wasn't the case here, so there's nothing I can do about that one. but when it's available to me, I use it. So the URL for this one is going to be BG for background underscore tree trunks. After all, that's what they are. .gif. Now this is an interesting one because it's not a very big image, and we're going to have to really carefully position it. All right, we'll stop here because it'll give us an interesting effect. Save. I'm going to go to IE and refresh. And notice what happens. We've got tree trunks all along this area. Why? Because it's repeating. So we want to stop the repeating, but if we stop the repeating, it's going to be only over here. So we've got to position it exactly so it lines up properly. So let's do some more work on that. This one you have to be really careful with. So first thing we're going to do is say no repeat. And the next business would be the positioning of it. Okay, let's no repeat it first, go back to IE, refresh, and see what we get. All right, now it's just once, and it's over here. Now I didn't make this image to be as wide as the image above. I just made a little section. It's only about this wide, just to cover those trees. I suppose I could have made it so that it went all the way across to the same point, the full length 720, and maybe even had some of the mountain and clouds faintly in the background, but I thought that would just kind of interfere with the text that we have here, so I just made a little chunk of it under these trees here. So that forces us to position it much more carefully. Okay, if I take this image into Photoshop, I can measure the XY coordinates into that spot right there where the first tree trunk has to go, and that's kind of how I arrived at this number that I'm about to put out there. It's 582 pixels wide. You have to say px, and not wide but across rather, and 0 pixels down, meaning it's actually at the very top of that area. The width, I'm sorry, the height of the image exactly matches the height of that area again, so we don't have any issue with having to worry about what's going to be happening, positioning it really in a vertical way. All right, back to IE, and this is basically just going to shift this across into position. So when we refresh, it shifts across right underneath the spots where we wanted it. Trial and error could get you that too, but it's no fun. So I just cheated and looked it up in the program Photoshop that I was using. Okay, so that takes care of the breadcrumbs. We're done and we're moving along now. Now the wrapper, again, the wrapper in the HTML, the wrapper is the ID that's right below the body. Okay, so for the wrapper, what we want to do is place, I better refresh this because we're behind where we are there. The wrapper is going to be used to place this left-hand column image. And the reason I had to use a wrapper for that is because if I just put it on the navigational div itself, the problem with that is that the div does not extend very far down, and it doesn't look good when that image stops right here and the rest of the page goes, and you have this blank area here without that continuation of the image and color. So what I did was I wrapped these guys up so that I'm actually putting a div on the background on the div, and so the div covers this whole area, so the background comes down, so it won't stop here. So it's a little tricky, but it worked. So we could use .nav and do that. And we'll see what happens. I'll use .nav and then we'll come back and use .wrapper. If we go background now, I'll just put the image on there. The image that we want on there is the URL of BG underscore green underscore gradient. Gradient is kind of a fading image from one color to another. In this case, it's from a darker green to a lighter green, JPG. And we're going to tell it to repeat in the Y direction. All right, and let's see, this isn't going to work out just the way we want it, but we'll get the idea. Okay, it looks fine here, but as we go down, you see how it stops at the end of that div. When the content for that div ends, so does the background image. The background image just covers the actual area it is on. So I didn't particularly like that look. I wanted it to extend to the bottom of the page. You can get that effect by putting it on the body, but we've already got this background on the body. You can only put one background image per element, so I had to sort of invent that wrapper div in order to place it on that. All right, so let's change that selector from .nav back to what it was before, .wrapper. With that simple change, coming back to IE, now you see that it extends nicely down to the very bottom of the page, which is what we want. So that div is there solely for that purpose. I wrestled with that for a while, and then I figured out, hey, just put that other div and put it on there and solve the problem. The div has no other purpose. All right, continuing now into that same section, we're going to now work with, as you can see the next selectors coming, have to do with links. So we're in that navigation area, and the only links in that navigation area are the buttons. Okay, come back to the browser for just 1 second to show you what I'm talking about. We're looking at these links here. Right now the links just kind of change color from black to purple. This, by the way, is a special formatting on the page that we're currently on. This is a packages page. It's Greek Island packages. As you can see, it was the first link from the home page we took before we got into what kind of packages we wanted. At any rate, the others are just straight links that don't have much styling except for basic stuff. What we want to do is drop those buttons behind the button graphics behind them. Okay, and I want to remind you the button graphics are here. It's BG button up, which is the normal up state, and then when you mouse over or click one, it should be in the down state, BG button DN for down. So those are the files we're going to be working with. All right, so we have for link and for visited, it's up, and for hover and active, it's down. And before I go any further, I should note that I didn't put any positioning on the wrapper. It's not entirely necessary because we're taking the defaults, but top and left were the positioning. To be consistent, we've been doing that, putting positioning on everything, so I'll continue it. All right, back to our buttons now. So the background property values for the up state of these is going to be, okay, just in case we don't get the image coming in, we'll use colors. RGB. Now I'm going to use a different RGB approach here and use percentages. This is yet another way of representing color in CSS. I think this is one of the more intuitive ways to do it. It's 50% of the red, 55% of the green, and 50% of the blue. I think we can all understand that that's half of the red, a little more than half of the green, and half of the blue. So we've got a little more green, so it's kind of a medium dark gray with a green tinge to it. And that's probably a lot easier to figure than if you're looking at a number like that, or even like that, or even the new RGBs that we saw earlier. All right, I'm also going to put a background color on the hover states. Before we get the images in, we'll use colors. This is going to be also given in RGB terms, and it's much lighter when you mouse over. 80%, 89%, 73%. So clearly much lighter. And we'll stop there and we'll just see that if we don't get any images into this picture at all, we still will have what look to be buttons that function reasonably well. You can see basically the mouse over looks very much like the packages does currently, except for the border that's not there. But otherwise, you can see that we pretty much have the buttons intact. Now, why are they that specific width and height? Well, we'll have to come back to the CSS in the basic area and look that up a little bit, because that is important. And we come down into the nav section, and let's look at the now the A links in the nav area, as well as the You Are Here one, which is the one that is packages. It's made to display as block, and its width is 100 pixels wide by 25 pixels high. Now, let's come back and look at these buttons. 100 pixels wide by 25 pixels tall. So it's made perfectly to match up with the button that's about to be used as its background. So let's come back in now here, and you can see that all we have to do is add the URL for that, and we'll have it. For the upstate, it's bg underscore button underscore up dot gif. We don't really need to, but I'm going to say no repeat. They're identically sized, so there's no way it's going to repeat anyway, but who knows. And I suppose you could say top left, but again, that's really not needed because there's no place for these things to repeat or be positioned within there. Okay, now the other one, we'll do them both here, is going to be URL. In fact, why don't we copy this thing and paste it? It's so much same except for the word down instead of up. It's just DN instead of UP. It's also not repeated and also in the top left. Okay, so let's save. Let's go to the browser and let's refresh. And bingo, we have buttons. And when we mouse over, you can see the black that went to purple is still there. But mainly it's the button graphic getting a little bit lighter, and the border. Now these are not CSS borders. The border is actually on the graphic. I chose to do it that way. And you can see that because it's darker on the right and bottom initially and lighter there when you mouse over, that it gives it sort of a 3D effect. It almost looks like it's going down in as you mouse over and click on it. Okay, so that's that. Now the main area we have left still to work on, I'm going to go to our final result here, is this area on the right. So we're done with everything else except this area on the right. We have a purple gradient here, which ends up being used also, as I mentioned before, on these H4s. Okay, let's come back and take a look at that area. Now, island info is the name of the div that basically is that entire column. So here we want a background consisting of the color, RGB. I'm going to give that again in percentages, 66%, comma 47%, comma 66%. Now you may be wondering, where the heck do you get these numbers? Well, sometimes you're in a graphics program and you're trying to figure out what color is in the graphic, and that's the way it gives them to you. And so to be exact, you come back into your CSS and use that same number. Other times it's just the number that you prefer to play around with when you're guessing colors, or you may be given from a website that that's giving you, various color combinations to choose from. So that's nice. There's the flexibility there built into CSS to match whatever your particular comfort level might be. All right, there's the background color, and I'm going to stick with that initially. We'll put our semicolon, which I suppose we don't really need at the moment, but we'll keep it there, and we'll come back into the browser, and we're just going to see the background color on that column so we know what we're dealing with. There it is. Now, I purposely did not want this one to extend down. I took a different approach than I did on the left-hand side, where I really did want that image to extend down. So here we have just a background color. Now we want to put the background image right in this area, and it's going to be sort of a a fade from this color to this, so it's not so much of a contrasty break in color here. It's going to be a gradient from that to that. And it will actually extend down underneath where the island word is. It's going to come down in this area. Okay, if we look at that image, it's this one. It's not very wide. It's 50 pixels wide and 49 pixels tall. Now the 50 wide is not enough to cover this area. This is longer than 50 wide, so we will have to repeat it horizontally in the X direction. But we don't want it to repeat in the Y direction. So let's bring it in. It's URL. It's BG underscore purple. Whoops, one P in purple. Underscore gradient. Just like our green gradient. Dot JPEG. Gradients are almost always JPEGs. And then we're going to repeat it in the X direction only, to keep it from repeating, all over that column. When we save, now I didn't give a location for this, did I? Top left would work. Top left is defaulted anyway again, but I'm just throwing it in there. And there it is. So it basically is about this big, and then it repeats across. And you can see it a little bit under the word island. Now the only thing we don't have left is I decided to make use of it again underneath these areas here. Now they're not nearly 50 pixels high. So in this case we're putting a background over an area, and the background image is actually much taller than the area we're putting it on. And much like we positioned our image in the X direction to get our tree trunks here, we can position this image up or down, and it will basically affect how dark of a purple we get. The image will only show up when it's underneath the element itself, but we can position it around and you'll see the effect. It's kind of an interesting approach. So this is our last selector now. It's the Island Info H4. If you're confused on what that is, here's the Island Info div. We just put a background on it, and now we're going to go inside and put the background images on the H4s. Up to this point, every background image that we were placing was going only in one spot. Now we're going to use the selector of £island info space H4, and we're actually going to be putting the same image at the same time on all three of these H4s. You can see the selector there. Alright, so here we go. Background, colon, and the color, I'm not sure that we even need the color, because if the image didn't show up, then we're still okay with it being just as it is. But the main thing is the URL here. It's BG underscore purple. It's the same one. So in that case, why don't we just copy and paste? We'll copy and paste. I'll go ahead and leave the RGB in there. And the difference is this repeat, there's no repeating to be done in the, yes there is, it's still not wide enough to cover the H4, so we still do need to repeat. It's the top left part that we're going to want to play with. Now we want it, well, let's just see what it looks like, then we'll come back and tweak it. All right, let's go, and we're going to look at these three H4s and see what they look like. Okay, now I think you'd agree that's too dark to deal with the black text. Okay, and why is it so dark? Because we're getting the very top part of the gradient right in this area, and it is too dark in there. But if we were to tell this background image to move up, basically kind of drag and drop this up a bit, now the part that goes up won't be visible because it's only visible in the area of the H4 itself, and the gradient obviously gets lighter as it goes down. So we'll just have a lighter starting point and then it'll fade down. So by experimenting, remember it's about 49 pixels tall. I don't know exactly how many pixels this area itself is, but by trial and error, instead of saying top, we can use a negative x to move it up. So it would be negative some number of pixels. We can try different settings. If, for example, we just did a negative, say, 15 pixels, that's now that is the vertical positioning, and then kept it at its left. You know what? I think I screwed up, because this is actually supposed to be left and top. Remember this one? This is horizontal positioning and then vertical positioning. So we need to fix these. These should all say left top, left space top instead of top space left. I apologize for that. Just realized as I was starting to put that one in there that I had been doing those wrong. It really didn't matter just because they all kind of fit into their places anyway. And the browser, I guess, kind of figured it out. But it becomes more important when you're using pixel measurements. So these should really, to be technically correct, be left space top. Now this one should be, this one does matter, left space and then negative 15 pixels, moving it up 15 pixels from its current position, thus allowing more of the lighter purple to show up. Alright, let's take a look at how dark it is. When I refresh, it gets lighter. You can see that. Now there's still a bit of a difference between the purple on the bottom and the purple here. If you want it to blend even more so, then you can move it up a little bit more. It's just a matter of your taste in terms of what you would like it to look like. It still, I suppose, could go up a little bit more and make it even lighter yet. I'm going to move it up to 25, where I think it is even better. There it is. It's a little more subtle now, and it almost just kind of blends right into the bottom nicely. And so it's just not quite as strong an effect, but sometimes subtlety can go a long way. With that, we have completed our page. And you can see these links, by the way, were made so that the background is exactly the same as the background that the page has, the body tag rather. So it kind of bleeds right through there. Again, we have the same situation where IE doesn't want to support recognizing when you're mousing over these things to the left or to the right of them, but other browsers do, such as Firefox, Netscape, etc. Alright, I think the last thing that we should be thinking about doing is taking these styles, the ones that we just did. I'm going to do Control A to select them all. I'm going to do Control C to copy, and I'm going to go and into the W3C validation service. You can see the URL here. It's jigsaw.w3.org/CSS-validator. And I'm going to paste in the code that we just did and check it and make sure there aren't any mistakes. You should always be doing this yourself. This is the note that you want to see, no error or warning found. Ta-da, we are done. We have done quite a bit of different and interesting approaches towards backgrounds, and hopefully this, if nothing else, I know when I learned this material, it really just opened my eyes to what could be done, and you start thinking about putting backgrounds all over the place. If we just look at this further, I could have put a background image, on this text. You can put spans on things and you can put a background image on the G if you want to. I mean, you can really get kind of crazy with it. I didn't use background images on the traveler's tip. Could have done that. There's all kinds of things that you could have done. If you have, of course, some graphics capabilities yourself personally, it really can go a long way towards launching your design into a different level. But even if you're a novice in graphic work, you can still add a little here or there just with some basic graphical skills. And so we will close at this point, and I just want to say again thank you for your patience, and hopefully you'll learn a few useful things about backgrounds that you can take advantage of in your future web design. Thank you.